The champagne flowed and the billionaires laughed, looking right through the heavy-set waitress, clearing their tables. To them she was invisible. But to the most dangerous man in Chicago, she was the only woman in the room. And when the music slowed, he did the unthinkable. He asked her to dance. The grand ballroom of the Belmont Plaza Hotel was a sea of glittering diamonds, bespoke tuxedos, and the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume. It was the annual Winter Solstice Gala, a playground for Chicago's elite, where millionaires and socialites gathered to flaunt their wealth under the guise of charity. For Penelope Hayes, it was just another night of blistered heels and aching joints. Penelope was a big woman. She was fat, a fact she had lived with her entire life, and one that society never let her forget. Her standard-issue catering uniform, a crisp white button-down and a black pencil skirt, clung to her broad hips and thick thighs, the fabric offering no forgiveness. As she navigated the crowded ballroom with a silver tray hoisted on her shoulder, she felt the familiar, heavy gaze of judgment. She was accustomed to the side eyes from slender women in backless silk gowns, the sneers from men who looked at her as if she had ruined their evening simply by existing in their peripheral vision. To the high society of Chicago, Penelope was not a person. She was a piece of cumbersome furniture that occasionally handed them a glass of Dom Perignon. "Excuse me," Penelope murmured, trying to squeeze past a group of businessmen discussing offshore accounts. They didn't move. They simply raised their voices, forcing Penelope to press her back against a marble pillar, holding her tray of empty crystal flutes high above her head to avoid spilling the dregs onto their Italian leather shoes. She took a deep breath, the corset-like tightness of her uniform digging into her ribs. She was exhausted. She had been working for 14 hours straight, bouncing from a morning shift at a diner to this high-end catering gig, just to keep the heat on in her dilapidated apartment. Across the room, standing near the towering ice sculpture, was Lorenzo Moretti. Lorenzo was a man who commanded the room without saying a word. He was the head of the Moretti crime family, a syndicate that had a stranglehold on the city's shipping ports, unions, and underground casinos. Broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, and possessing a gaze as cold as a frozen lake, Lorenzo was a predator among domestic pets. He was only at the gala to keep up appearances, a necessary evil to maintain his legitimate business fronts. Flanked by his two most trusted lieutenants, Matteo and Vincent, Lorenzo watched the pathetic display of the city's elite with masked boredom, until his dark eyes landed on her. Penelope was currently navigating the treacherous path near the VIP tables. She was entirely focused on her task, her soft, round face flushed with the heat of the room and the physical exertion of carrying the heavy tray. Lorenzo watched the way she moved. Despite her size, there was a careful grace to her steps, a quiet dignity in the way she kept her chin up, even as the wealthy patrons visibly recoiled from her proximity. "Look at the absolute state of that!" A cruel, mocking voice sliced through the hum of the string quartet. The voice belonged to Veronica Hastings, a notoriously vicious socialite draped in emerald green satin. Veronica was holding a martini glass, swaying slightly on her stilettos, surrounded by a coven of similarly rail-thin friends. Penelope tried to lower her head and pass quietly, but Veronica wasn't about to let the opportunity for entertainment slip by. As Penelope walked past, Veronica subtly stuck out her foot. The heavy heel of Penelope's sensible black shoe caught the satin edge of Veronica's designer heel. The momentum threw Penelope forward. Time seemed to slow down. She twisted her body instinctively to avoid crashing into the table of wealthy guests, taking the full brunt of the fall herself. Crash. The silver tray hit the polished marble floor with a deafening clatter. Dozens of crystal flutes shattered, spraying shards of glass and sticky champagne across the floor. Penelope hit the ground hard, her knees taking the impact, her breath knocked out of her lungs. The ballroom went dead silent. The string quartet screeched to a halt. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, the only sound was the tinkling of settling glass. Then the laughter started. It wasn't a sympathetic chuckle. It was a cruel, roaring laughter. Veronica Hastings covered her mouth in mock horror, though her eyes danced with malicious glee. "Oh my God," Veronica loudly whispered to her friends. "I think she just caused an earthquake. Did anyone check the Richter scale?" More laughter erupted. People pointed. The hotel manager, a nervous, sweating man named Mr. Peterson, began power-walking across the room, his face purple with rage. Penelope sat on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass. Her knees throbbed, and a hot, searing flush of ultimate humiliation crawled up her neck and coated her cheeks. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was fat, yes. She was clumsy tonight, yes. But she would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. With trembling hands, she began picking up the sharp, jagged pieces of crystal, cutting her thumb in the process. A bright bead of crimson blood welled up, mixing with the spilled champagne. Across the room, Lorenzo Moretti handed his bourbon glass to Matteo. "Boss?" Matteo asked, sensing the sudden shift in the air. The temperature around Lorenzo seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Lorenzo didn't answer. He hated bullies. He hated people who punched down. In his world, violence had a purpose, a code. This was just the meaningless cruelty of spoiled children. He watched the heavy-set woman on the floor, bleeding, humiliated, trying to salvage her dignity, while a room full of millionaires laughed at her. He saw the strength in her jawline as she refused to cry. Lorenzo adjusted his cuffs and began to walk across the ballroom floor. The crowd parted for Lorenzo Moretti like the Red Sea. They didn't know the full extent of his criminal empire. They thought he was merely a ruthless venture capitalist, but they knew enough to be terrified of him. The laughter in the room began to die down, rippling into nervous silence as the tall, imposing figure strode toward the scene of the accident. Mr. Peterson, the manager, reached Penelope first. "You stupid, clumsy girl," he hissed, grabbing Penelope by the upper arm and hauling her roughly to her feet. Penelope winced, her weight shifting onto her bruised knees. "You're fired. Clean this up and get out the back door before I call the police for property damage." "Let her go." The voice was low, smooth, and laced with absolute authority. Mr. Peterson froze, turning to see Lorenzo Moretti standing merely inches away. Lorenzo's dark eyes were fixed on the manager's hand, which was still gripping Penelope's arm. "Mr. Moretti," Mr. Peterson stammered, instantly releasing Penelope as if she were made of burning coals. "I'm so sorry for this disruption. The catering staff is usually highly vetted." "I said," Lorenzo repeated softly, stepping closer. "Step away from her." The manager swallowed hard and practically scrambled backward, blending into the crowd. Penelope stood frozen, clutching her bleeding hand to her chest. She looked up at the man standing before her. He was breathtakingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw shadow, and eyes so dark they looked like obsidian. But there was danger rolling off him in waves. She felt suddenly very small, a rarity for her. Lorenzo looked at the blood dripping from her thumb. Without a word, he reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pristine, monogrammed silk handkerchief, and gently took her hand. Gasps echoed around the room. Veronica Hastings' jaw practically unhinged. "Press this against the cut," Lorenzo instructed, his large, warm hands carefully wrapping the silk around Penelope's thick fingers. Thank you," Penelope stammered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I have to clean this up." "You aren't cleaning anything," Lorenzo said, his gaze flicking to the crowd. He locked eyes with Veronica Hastings. The socialite flinched under his dead-eyed stare. "The hotel staff will handle it. After all, it wasn't your fault you were tripped." A collective murmur swept through the room. Lorenzo had seen it. Just then, as if trying to desperately diffuse the suffocating tension in the room, the orchestra conductor tapped his baton and frantically signaled the band to play. A slow, sweeping jazz melody filled the air. Lorenzo turned his attention back to Penelope. He took in her flushed face, her messy hair escaping its bun, and the curves of her body that the world so viciously mocked. Where they saw excess, he saw warmth, softness, and a resilient spirit. He took a half step back, placed his left hand behind his back, and extended his right hand toward her. "Dance with me," Lorenzo commanded gently. Penelope stared at his open palm as if it were a loaded gun. "What?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Dance with me," he repeated. "Show them you aren't broken." I can't," Penelope breathed, looking down at her stained uniform and her heavy frame. "Sir, you don't want to do this. Look at me. They're already laughing. If you do this, they'll laugh at you too." Lorenzo stepped into her personal space, his imposing height forcing her to tilt her head up. "Let them laugh at me," he murmured, his voice only for her. "I promise you, Penelope, no one in this room has the courage to laugh at Lorenzo Moretti." Penelope blinked, stunned. He knew her name? She glanced at her cheap plastic name tag. Of course he did. Slowly, hesitantly, as if in a trance, she placed her hand in his. Lorenzo pulled her against him. He didn't hesitate or leave an awkward space between them. He drew her full, heavy body flush against his hard, muscular frame. One hand rested firmly on the small of her back, the other clasping her hand, silk handkerchief and all. He guided her into the center of the dance floor. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the music. Hundreds of eyes watched in stunned disbelief as the most powerful, intimidating man in Chicago waltzed with the fat, clumsy waitress. Penelope was stiff with terror. She had never danced with a man before, let alone a man who felt like a coiled panther in a designer suit. She stumbled on the first step, her face burning. "Look at me," Lorenzo ordered softly. "Only me. Follow my lead." Penelope dragged her eyes up to his face. There was no pity in his expression. There was only intense, razor-sharp focus. As they moved together, Lorenzo adjusted his stride to perfectly match hers. He was leading her with absolute confidence, making her feel surprisingly light on her feet. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered as he twirled her gently. "Because I despise parasites," Lorenzo replied, shooting a dark look over her shoulder at the high society crowd. "And because you showed more grace on that floor than anyone else in this room possesses in their entire lives." Penelope's breath hitched. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever looked at her like she was a woman, a real woman, worthy of protection and respect. "You're very kind, Mr. Moretti," she said softly. "But you're ruining your suit. My uniform is covered in champagne." "I have a dozen suits just like it," Lorenzo said smoothly. He looked down at her. his dark eyes analyzing her face. "You work too hard, Penelope Hayes. A diner uniform under your catering clothes, the exhaustion under your eyes." Penelope stiffened in his arms. How did he know about the diner uniform? She had left her pink collar poking out underneath her white catering shirt, but it was barely noticeable. "I have debts," Penelope said defensively, her chin rising. "My family, my father, left us with a lot of bad paper. I'm just doing what I have to do to keep my mother in her care facility." Lorenzo's hand tightened slightly on her waist. The slow jazz music seemed to fade into a low hum in his ears. He had his men run background checks on everyone working the VIP section tonight for security reasons, but he hadn't put the pieces together until this very moment. "William Hayes," Lorenzo said, his voice suddenly dropping an octave, losing its gentle warmth and replacing it with a cold, metallic edge. Penelope missed a step. You knew my father?" Lorenzo stared down at the curvy, beautiful woman in his arms. William Hayes was a degenerate gambler and an embezzler. 3 years ago, William had stolen over $400,000 from one of the Moretti family's underground casinos. Before Lorenzo's men could exact their retribution, William had suffered a fatal heart attack, leaving the debt unpaid. Lorenzo had written it off as a loss. He hadn't realized William had a daughter. He certainly hadn't realized that the daughter was currently working 3 jobs, destroying her body, to pay back the loan sharks who ultimately reported to him. "I knew of him," Lorenzo said smoothly, though his mind was racing with dark, possessive calculations. The men Penelope was paying every week, the men who threatened her, who took every dime she bled for, were his subordinates. She was paying him. The music swelled to a close. Lorenzo spun Penelope one last time, catching her securely in his arms. The room remained deadly silent. "Thank you for the dance, Penelope," Lorenzo whispered, his lips grazing her ear, sending a violent shiver down her spine. "I have a feeling we will be seeing a lot more of each other." Before Penelope could ask what he meant, Lorenzo released her, stepped back, and adjusted his suit jacket. He signaled to Matteo and Vincent, and without a backward glance at the stunned elite of Chicago, Lorenzo Moretti walked out of the ballroom, leaving Penelope standing alone under the chandelier, her world entirely changed. The harsh fluorescent lights of the downtown diner buzzed like an angry hornet's nest, casting long, deeply depressing shadows across the damaged floorboards. Penelope wiped down the sticky laminate counter with a damp rag, her mind entirely consumed by the memory of the previous night. She could still perfectly feel the phantom heat of Lorenzo Moretti's large hand pressed firmly against the small of her back. The way his dark, piercing eyes had commanded the ballroom, protecting her from the cruel laughter of Chicago's elite, felt like a brilliant scene pulled directly from a vivid dream. But the sharp throb in her bruised knees and the throbbing cut on her thumb were grounded in harsh reality. She adjusted her pink waitress apron, feeling the familiar heavy ache in her lower back. The diner was nearly empty, smelling faintly of stale coffee and burnt bacon grease. Outside, the freezing rain lashed violently against the greasy glass windows, perfectly mirroring the cold dread pooling in her stomach. Today was Friday. Friday meant collection day. She reached into her pocket, brushing against the thin envelope of cash. It was painfully short. She was exactly $200 short. The diner door chimed sharply, violently shattering the quiet morning air. A gust of biting winter wind swept into the establishment, carrying with it a pungent scent of cheap cologne and damp leather. Penelope froze, her heart plummeting straight into her stomach. Dominic stood menacingly in the doorway. He was a brute of a man, with a thick neck, a repeatedly broken nose, and a cruel scar slicing deeply through his eyebrow. He was the local enforcer for the underground syndicate, the ruthless monster specifically assigned to collect her father's impossible, towering debt. Dominic slammed the heavy glass door shut, his heavy boots thudding ominously against the checkered linoleum floor as he stalked directly toward her station. He didn't bother sitting down at a booth. He simply slammed his calloused hands flat onto the counter, leaning aggressively over into Penelope's personal space. She instinctively took a frightened step back, her spine hitting the massive commercial coffee machine. "Good morning, sweet cheeks," Dominic sneered, his breath smelling aggressively of stale cigarettes and cheap peppermint gum. "You know exactly what day it is. Stop wasting my time and hand it over." Penelope's hands trembled violently as she slowly reached into her pocket. She pulled out the pathetic, remarkably thin envelope and placed it carefully on the counter. Dominic snatched the envelope with alarming, predatory speed. He ripped it open violently, his thick fingers clumsily flipping through the crumpled $20 bills. Penelope held her breath, her pulse roaring loudly in her ears like a runaway freight train. The enforcer's expression instantly darkened, his heavy brow furrowing in violent, uncontrollable anger. He crumpled the empty envelope in his massive fist, throwing it aggressively onto the dirty ground. "This is a sick joke, right?" Dominic barked, his voice echoing loudly across the empty diner. "You are $200 short, Penelope. We had a firm, non-negotiable agreement." Penelope swallowed hard, trying desperately to keep her voice steady, despite the overwhelming terror suffocating her. "I'm so sorry, Dominic. I accidentally dropped a tray at my catering gig last night. They fired me on the spot and completely docked my final pay for the broken crystal glass. I will have the absolute rest of the money by Tuesday, I swear to you." Dominic laughed, a harsh, terrifying, humorless sound that sent icy shivers racing down Penelope's spine. "The boss doesn't care." Dominic's eyes glinted with malicious intent. "The boss wants his money on Friday, and since you do not have the required cash, we are going to have to find another, more creative way for you to pay." Before Penelope could even fully register his terrifying implied threat, Dominic reached aggressively across the sticky laminate counter, his large hand violently grabbing the front collar of her cheap pink uniform. He yanked her forward with terrifying, brutal force, entirely ignoring her sudden gasp of pain. "Maybe we can put you to work in one of the underground clubs," Dominic hissed maliciously, a disgusting smirk painting his scarred face. "You're a very heavy girl, but there are plenty of sick guys out there who like a whole lot of cushion for the pushing. You'll make up the financial shortage in no time at all." Tears of sheer terror and ultimate burning humiliation filled Penelope's eyes. She struggled frantically against his unyielding iron grip, her soft hands pushing desperately against his broad, muscular chest. "Let me go!" she cried out loudly, sheer panic rising sharply in her chest. "Please, let me go! I promise I will get the money!" Penelope squeezed her eyes shut, terrified. Then the cheerful chime of the diner door rang out once again, completely interrupting the brutal assault. "Remove your filthy hand from her right now, before I permanently sever it from your wrist." The masculine voice was impossibly smooth, dangerously quiet, and resonated with absolute, terrifying, unquestionable authority. Dominic froze instantly, turning as still as a stone statue. The vicious, mocking sneer melted rapidly from his scarred face, replaced entirely by a pathetic mask of sudden, paralyzing dread. He rapidly released Penelope's uniform, as if her cheap fabric had suddenly burst into scalding, uncontrollable flames. Penelope stumbled backward awkwardly, gasping heavily for much-needed air, clutching her wrinkled collar tightly. Standing elegantly and imposing in the doorway of the run-down diner was Lorenzo Moretti. He looked entirely, perfectly out of place in the dingy, smelling establishment, dressed impeccably in a bespoke navy cashmere overcoat and a dark silk tie. Behind him stood Matteo and Vincent, his two loyal, massive lieutenants, their hands resting casually but dangerously inside their tailored jackets. Lorenzo's dark, intimidating obsidian eyes were locked fiercely onto Dominic, radiating a cold, murderous, seething fury that seemed to drastically lower the room's temperature by several degrees. Dominic practically shrunk into himself, trembling violently under the intense glare. "Mr. Moretti," Dominic stammered pathetically, his harsh voice cracking heavily with undeniable fear. "I absolutely didn't expect you here, boss. I was just efficiently handling a standard collection on the Hayes debt. The girl is short on her weekly envelope today. I was just giving her a standard routine warning." Lorenzo took slow, highly deliberate, predatory steps toward the counter, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking softly against the cheap, peeling linoleum. He didn't even briefly glance at the crumpled envelope resting on the floor. His eyes flicked briefly to Penelope, accurately absorbing her pale, terrified face and the rough, angry red mark blossoming visibly on her neck where Dominic had grabbed her uniform. A terrifying, violent darkness swirled actively in Lorenzo's gaze. He quickly turned his fierce attention back to the intensely trembling enforcer. "You work for my family, Dominic," Lorenzo said softly, his voice remaining dangerously low. "We have clearly established rules. We have a strict, unbreakable code of conduct. We do not place our hands on innocent women. We do not threaten them with forced labor in our clubs. Ever." Dominic swallowed audibly, cold sweat pouring rapidly down his pale forehead. "Boss, please, I was genuinely just trying to secure the family's and his money. William Hayes repeatedly stole from us." Lorenzo stopped merely inches from Dominic's trembling form. "William Hayes is dead," Lorenzo stated coldly. "The debt died completely with him. You will never, ever approach this woman again. If you ever breathe in her general direction, I will personally ensure you are fed directly to the feral dogs guarding the shipyard. Do you explicitly understand my incredibly clear, final instructions, Dominic?" Dominic aggressively nodded his head. "Yes, boss. Completely, totally understood." He practically squeaked. "Now get out of my sight right now before I change my mind," Lorenzo commanded softly. Dominic scrambled frantically toward the exit, nearly tripping clumsily over his own large feet in his desperate, pathetic haste to escape the diner. The heavy door slammed shut loudly behind him, leaving a thick, incredibly heavy silence vibrating in its wake. Penelope stood completely frozen behind the counter, her mind desperately struggling to process the impossible, absurd situation. The handsome man who had gracefully saved her last night was the Mafia boss. Lorenzo turned slowly to face her, the terrifying, murderous edge instantly vanishing from his incredibly handsome face, replaced by a soft, profoundly warm concern. "Are you injured, Penelope?" he asked gently, stepping closer to the counter. Penelope slowly shook her head, her breathing still remarkably ragged and remarkably shallow. "You are the boss," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You own the impossible debt. You actually run the entire criminal syndicate." Lorenzo didn't bother to deny it. He simply extended his large, warm hand across the sticky counter. "My private car is waiting outside," he said firmly. "You are officially leaving this awful place." Penelope stared at his offered hand, immense confusion swirling in her mind. "Where would we possibly go?" she asked. "To my estate," Lorenzo replied without a single second of hesitation. "Your debt is entirely, permanently forgiven. But I am absolutely not letting you out of my sight. You require proper protection, and I require your presence." Penelope's eyes widened drastically. Despite her generous size, despite society constantly ignoring her, this incredibly powerful billionaire mafia boss wanted her. She took a deep, steadying breath, gathered her courage, and placed her hand in his. Lorenzo gently guided Penelope out of the diner, wrapping his expensive cashmere overcoat securely around her shivering, curvy shoulders. She finally belonged to a very powerful mafia king. If Penelope and Lorenzo's thrilling journey captured your heart, please do not let their story end here. Hit that like button to show your support for curvy heroines finding their powerful protectors. Share this dramatic tale with friends who love intense mafia romance, unexpected plot twists, and passionate love stories. Subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking, real-life inspired dramas delivered straight to your screen. Your engagement helps us bring more unforgettable, sweeping romantic sagas to life every single week.